excited. I want to welcome everyone today to the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. I'm Tita Chico, I'm faculty director, and I am very grateful to all of the support and work of my colleague, Dr. Karen Nelson, who's Director of Research Initiatives, and our graduate assistants. And I will say a few things and then hand this over to my wonderful colleague. First of all, this is a conversation that is taking place in the context of a year and a half, 2 years of programming on anti-racism. And this year we are developing a set of linked conversations that think about anti-racism through the rubrics of communities and collaborations. This rubric allows us to feature scholarship, teaching, and public engagement that all reimagine boundaries, model anti-racist inquiry, and foster collaborative relations on and beyond campus. I want to say one thing, kind of acknowledging where we are, even though we're all on Zoom, but I want to acknowledge the fact that where I am seated and the infrastructure that supports this is the land that's now known as the state of Maryland, which is adjacent, of course, to the District of Columbia, the seat of the US federal government. But this is the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. And I want us to think about and to reflect and honor the fact that these original homelands, the memory of the origin of these original homelands is only faintly registered on campus through the occasional named building. But this history is one that we are all collectively encumbered to honor, respect, and study. I will now turn this over to my colleague, Professor John Drabinski, who is collaborating with us for this program. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Tita. I also just wanted to say a couple of thank yous before we get started. First of all, to you, Tita, and the staff at the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies, participants, whether listening or speaking, we just come into the webinar and it happens, but it requires a lot of work, big and small. And so thank you to everybody for all of that effort and labor. It's also a collaboration with my home department, Department of African American Studies. And so I did want to also thank CT Ononu, who has worked with communications and publicity in the department. I really appreciate your help with this, CT. And most importantly, Sharon Hodgson, who I'm relatively new to the university. It's only my third semester. And so she really had to handhold me through a lot of this process of finding funding and so forth. I really appreciate Sharon's patience with all of that. In the African American Studies side, it is co-sponsored it's sponsored by the John B. Slaughter Foundation or endowment for lectures in African American Studies. And so I really appreciate that initiative. So I wanted to start, just introduce today's speakers. I'm really happy to have them. I have to say, in addition to having written really important books over the last couple of years, a couple of years back on Malcolm X, they're also two of my favorite thinkers generally, and their work I just have a real immense amount of respect for. And so I really love having a chance to share a screen with the two of you, maybe someday again in a different format in person. First, I'll introduce Dr. Peniel Joseph. He's the Barbara Jordan Chair, which, by the way, is a fantastic name to work under as a chair. Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs, and Professor of History, and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas in Austin. He lives in Austin, Texas as well. He's a frequent national commentator on issues of anti-racism, democracy, and civil rights. Anyone who watches political television has probably seen him speak on television. And I think in that, I have to say, you're really an exemplary case of public intellectual work, really keeping to the intellectual part as well as bringing it public facing. I appreciate that as someone who's not public facing, but values intellectual scholarship so much. He's written several books on African American history and politics, including the book we'll be talking about today, The Sword and the Shield. And before that, Stokely, A Life, which is just an absolutely amazing intellectual biography of Stokely Carmichael. I do also want to mention Till the Midnight Hour, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, which I believe was your first book and was really an amazing discovery for me when I read it. I feel like it's really a fantastic work that everybody should be reading. The Sword and the Shield, which we'll be talking about today, was named as one of Time Magazine's 100 must-read books from 2020. Also joining us is Dr. Michael Sawyer, who's an associate professor of African American literature and culture in the Department of English at University of Pittsburgh. He's published 2 monographs. First, an Africana philosophy of temporality, subtitled Homo Liminalis, an absolutely fantastic work for anyone who's interested in theoretical issues around race and time. I think it's a groundbreaking work. And most recently, the book he'll be talking about today, Black-Minded, which is subtitled The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X, published by Polity Press. He's working on 2 book-length projects. One, Ramifications of Ramifications, The Art and Philosophy of Toni Morrison, which I can't wait to see. A philosophical reading of Morrison is very much needed. And The Door of Return, a Phenomenology of Blackness, which I happen to have read a snippet of. And Michael, it's just an exciting piece, and I can't wait to see that. I think it'll actually shift a lot of our conversations in phenomenology and philosophy. So welcome both of you. It's really great to have you online and hear your thoughts on Malcolm X and his life and legacy. So I want to start off with what's probably a really unimaginative question, but I still always think is an interesting one, which is really about your motivations as authors. Like what motivated you to write about Malcolm X at this point, right? Into at this point, the 21st century. And I ask that for a couple of reasons. One is the existential event of authorship, right? We have to invest these incredible amount of energy and blood, sweat, and tears into research, writing, editing, the slow, patient process of it coming to publication, waiting for critics, waiting for reviews. And so something drives that. And so I'm really interested, what motivated the book. And the second, which is really a part of that same thing, which is, what is it about Malcolm X in 2021, right, that would motivate you to expend this energy? Like what pushed this work forward for you around Malcolm X, around the ideas, around life, legacy, and thought? So maybe Michael first, and then Peniel.
Sure. And first, I want to thank everyone for this great opportunity. There's never a time when I don't feel like spending time talking about Malcolm X, so I'm really appreciative of, and I've been so gratified from both John's work and Peniel's work. So this is really, really an awesome opportunity. I think for me, so I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 70s, right? So the Nation of Islam was kind of always a presence, right? And so when I finally read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was in college, not far from you all in College Park when I was in Annapolis, it was one of the few books that I read all the way through in kind of one sitting, right? I just couldn't put it down. And I had needed to be doing other stuff, but just couldn't stop doing it. So later in life, when I decided to go back to grad school, I think what sent me to grad school was wanting to spend time thinking about Phenon, right? Kind of Black radical thought from that perspective. When I got there, I realized how important Du Bois, Saidiya Hartman, Winter, all these other people happen to be as well. And then when I was writing my dissertation, I wanted to get some feedback on Phenon, and I decided to write H. Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Amin, in prison, right, to see what he thought about it. So I sent him the sections on Phenon from the book. And so he wrote me back, and then he called me, right? So we started talking about Fanon, and he said at one point, he's like, you're talking about Fanon, but you really should be talking about Malcolm X. And he said that, and I kind of mentioned this in the introduction to the book, right? And it made me, it took me aback for a second, because I realized that as a person who was studying kind of political theory, political philosophy, Black thought, I had situated Malcolm X from a perspective of his biography and an exemplary kind of character as somehow different than the people that I named, Fanon, Winter, Du Bois, et cetera, right? And going back through what H. Rep. Brown had said, I realized at that point that I was inefficiently examining the kind of import of his thinking on my own thinking, right? And that I spent a lifetime basically seeing the world like literally and figuratively, right? I used to, Malcolm, it's not lost on me that the Malcolm X glasses are iconic in a particular way. It's actually a way of seeing, right? Like the world through which he looks at the world, right? So I had been thinking about the world from that perspective, and it took that late in life and to have walked through this kind of, canon of Black thought to realize that really I was really thinking about Malcolm X the entire time. So then I kind of went back to my dissertation chair, Toni Bose, is like, is this something that should be done, right? I'm like, writing a book on Malcolm X is, Peniel has done this a couple of times with these kind of iconic figures, right? You're taking on this task, to your point, John, and he said, yeah, it needs to be done. And someone who spent a lifetime acculturated in and around Malcolm X's thought should be one of the people who actually takes the opportunity to do it. So that's kind of how the project evolved through, I think, it was really kind of organic process to get to it.
No, that's a great answer, Michael. And, I'll start by saying, yeah, I really appreciate, Michael's work, his body of work, and both on Malcolm X and just Africana studies, Africana philosophy, radical Black political thought, and John's work as well. So it's a privilege to be here. My story with Malcolm is one, I'm 49 and it goes back over 40 years. So I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants. I grew up in Brooklyn and Southside Jamaica, Queens. My mother is 82 years young now, but I remember her when she was in her 30s, and she was in her 40s. And she's part of SCIU 1199. And I say that because I grew up in a political household. And it was only when I got older, I understood how precious that was, because my mother is a historian, she's a feminist. We read in my household C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins in elementary school. My brother, who's an ER doctor, and I were raised to be hyper literate. So I could read and write well before I was a teenager, well before I was a teenager. And my mom expected that. So my mom's a very specific, very disciplined person, really human rights activist and social justice activist, but unbelievably disciplined. She didn't miss work, so you didn't miss school, ever, unless it was legit. And you had to have personal sincerity and political integrity. So long story short, I read the autobiography early. We lived in a Black household early. We lived in a Pan-Africanist household early. We lived in a household where we were talking about feminism, and we were talking about Baldwin, and we were talking about Malcolm and Martin at the dinner table. And we were talking about the Haitian Revolution, and we were talking about the Haitian Revolution in the context of what Michel Triot later talks about sans-souci, and my mom was telling us about Bookman. It just wasn't Toussaint. I've got a big picture of Toussaint in the other room. And so anyway, I've always loved Malcolm X, and I feel like I'm very much fortunate to have always loved Malcolm X. What I'll say is that love, and I'm quoting from Muhammad Ali, when Muhammad Ali says Cassius Clay in '64, when the reporters are asking him about Malcolm, right before he's going to be named Muhammad Ali, he says, I fell in love with Malcolm when he was showing those white folks, what was what, and debating them, right? And so for me, I remember Henry Hampton's Eyes on the Prize premiered when I was around in junior high school. And then there's Eyes on the Prize and Eyes on the Prize Part 2. So Part 1 premieres maybe around 87, 88. And Part 2 was like around 89, 90. And I was just starting high school, and that let me really see Malcolm. And I agree with what Professor Sawyer is saying in the sense of the world tries to act like he's not the most important Black theorist of humanity, of democracy, of the 20th century. But he is, and I was excited. And and I love Dr. King, and we could talk about Dr. King's importance too. But when we think about Malcolm, I was always aware of how generative his work was, right? But the deeper I became a student, the more generative I saw. So I did Midnight Hour. He's one of the anchors. Did Dark Days. He's one of the anchors. Stokely, he's impactful in setting up the paradigm that Stokely operated in, Kwame Ture. And now Sword and the Shield. And I'm working on a book. I'm working on a book on America's Third Reconstruction now, but I'm also going to be doing a book on Malcolm X's last year and what that means for us today. And I'm also going to be doing something on King as well. So these folks, I don't think they ever stop being generative in that sense. But I love how Michael was talking about Fanon, because I think that a lot of times, and now that Michael has done this work, he realizes, and he's showing us how important Malcolm X is. But a lot of times we set up a thing, even for graduate students, that it's these other people, right? And we have somebody born in Omaha, Nebraska, with Caribbean roots through his mother, right? Yeah. With Black Southern roots through his father, who, again, people want Hegel, they want Du Bois. We have Malcolm too. You know what I'm saying? So we have our Black genius, not just this whole thing of, oh, he was from the ghetto and he's a prisoner. We're saying, and Michael's book shows, in terms of political thought, he's a genius in terms of political thought, just political thought. He's an intellectual genius in addition to the activism and the organizing and stuff. So his work is so generative, it's hugely important, but I'm really happy that he's getting a heyday right now, in the sense that people realize that, when we look at the speeches, when we see what Malcolm is doing, the writings, the diary, this is somebody whose legacy continues to resonate in our own time in a deep and sophisticated way, which is exciting to read. When I started graduate school in 1993, people were like, Malcolm X, Black Power, what do they have to teach us? That's how I went to graduate school, and I had to fight along the way. And now there's a whole group of amazing scholars. Michael is one of the leaders who are just like in it, and they're showing us. They're just showing us. And I've always tried to contribute to that because I was so excited about the potential when we investigated this.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm glad that I asked that. It's an unimaginative question, but I'm glad that I asked it, because I think these kinds of motivations, especially around the shift from Fanon to Hegel, sort of outsourcing Black radicalism and seeing it closer to home. I think that's a really important thing to take note of, and I think both books really follow through with what both of you said. And so thinking then about reinterpreting, revisiting Malcolm X, so maybe a little twist on the question is, how do you think about revisiting Malcolm X in 2021? And what I mean by that is what maybe we could call like a genre shift around Black political mobilization, organization, thought, and action. Part of the 19th century, and certainly nearly to the end, if not all the way through the 20th century, that sort of organization, thought, and mobilization came through speeches, letters, diaries, autobiographies, and when I think about that shift from sort of speeches, pamphlets, letters to the 21st century, where so much mobilization has been around, diffuse, short, quick avenues for mobilization, organization, and even I think seeding of thoughts has happened in a social media context, right? I mean, even blogs at some level are dead, right? If they were sort of a remnant of speeches and letters. So when I've taught, King, when I've taught X, when I've taught so many figures, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, the students find it almost a little bit quaint, that somebody could give a speech and it could change so many things, right? And so thinking about Malcolm X as someone who so fundamentally impacted the world through speech, right, and through pamphlets and letters, I'm curious to think about, what it means to bring him into the 21st century, right? Either as a corrective, a lesson, or maybe as someone who needs a sort of reprocessing in light of our more diffuse notions of organization and intellectual work around racial justice movements. And I would add to that the way this genre shift has so impacted the very notion of leadership, right? That when you function around speeches, for example, the speech giver is elevated to a centerpiece in terms of leadership. But we don't live so much in that era now. And so I just wonder about what your thoughts are in bringing Malcolm X to 2021 in this context, or it's sort of seen in this context.
I'll take a stab at I think what Peniel's work and even in his answer shows so powerfully is that with Malcolm, the importance of Malcolm is his relationship to what I'll just call the Black commons, just for, as a kind of a marker, but not to be reductive or hierarchical about it, right? It's common people in common language understanding what are common problems, right? And I think that in many ways, John, to your question, I think really in the 21st century, kind of the long 18th century, right? Basically, for Black people, right? Malcolm was always way out ahead, I think, of our thinking. And in many ways, I think we're basically now catching up to where he was in the first place, right? There's questions of Black internationalism, the question of a type of Black nationalism that's unmoored to land, et cetera, these kinds of issues that he had already thought through. So in many ways, even his relationship to thinking, what I call in the book, kind of thinking in motion, is much like the discourse that exists now on social media, right? He's taking in external stimuli constantly and responding in the moment, right? And this is what's so interesting about where Peniel took us to think about Ali, right? Because Ali and his fighting is exactly the same kind of way, right? It's external stimulus and then some response to it. Malcolm's doing the same thing kind of rhetorically and in his thinking, right? And so he's never afraid to say he's wrong. He's never afraid to change his position. And it's because the world changes rapidly. And I think part of what happens in the kind of common philosophical, theoretical, even historical discourse is that so many things get held in place in order for an argument to be made, right? Malcolm was able to see the kind of mosaic of things that are happening and then be able to make his argument. And it was up to the listener to then be able to situate and understand where he was at that moment, right? He had very little time to do this, right? He's moving so rapidly from, when we become aware of him as a person who's interested in activism or starts having some voice to his untimely assassination, right? There's not a lot of time even to accomplish this. So in many ways, and this is to think about, the kind of non-linearity of Black time in the first place, Malcolm X had lived several lifetimes during the period of time that we care about him, right? Several intellectual times, right? And I think that's a very 21st century, very much a type of distribution network question where he's got a network that can get his voice out very quickly and it gets dispersed very rapidly amongst the people. So I think that's how I would see the 21st century basically catching up to where Malcolm was as a thinker back in the 20th century.
And I would add to what Michael just said, which is brilliant. I think that in the 21st century, what encapsulates what Malcolm was after, and we see it in panoramic depictions of Black leadership, including Black women, Black queer folks, the whole deal, under a movement for Black lives, is this idea of Black dignity, And I think that one of the things I argue in The Sword and the Shield, Black dignity versus citizenship, you need them both. But it's really very important for us to understand, well, what did Malcolm mean by Black dignity? And, the people who philosophize about Black dignity, You read the slave narratives of enslaved Black folks, they are philosophizing about Black dignity. Michael knows this very well. It's not just Frederick Douglass, it's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. When you read Ann Petrie, The Street, she's philosophizing about Black dignity. One of my future projects is a book project on what do I mean about this from across time and space. But what's interesting about Malcolm, he's defining it as both the ending of world white supremacy, but also he defines it in a way that Black people themselves have to understand their worth, and that their history begins before racial slavery, which is why he's such a passionate advocate of Africa and Pan-Africanism and the Middle East, right? And so when he talks about dignity, Malcolm is trying to convince Black people that the key to their own liberation is within their own traditions. And I think, Michael, you do this well in Black Minded, in the sense of you decenter a Eurocentric analysis of our intellectual liberatory praxis, So the reason why a lot of times Malcolm is not conceived as this first line thinker along the line of, whoever you want to say, Rawls or Hannah Arendt or whatever, is because we're taking it from this epistemological point of view that Malcolm radically deconstructs. It's Malcolm who's constantly talking about racial slavery. He's doing it analogous with a scholarly reinterpretation of racial slavery. But remember, he's talking about racial slavery even before Angela Davis's bravura essay about Black women in slavery while she's in prison, which is really, for my money, just one of the best essays ever written. You know what I mean? Because it does so much. And I know, Black philosophers love that essay, and African-American political thought, that new anthology, which I'm teaching actually this semester, Rogers and Turk, get into it. But I will close by saying, what's so interesting about Malcolm for today, the ideas are so generative that a movement for Black Lives Matter is doing it, continuing the ideas while expansively reconsidering who is the leadership model. So what's important about Black Lives Matter is this idea, all Black lives matter, that expands upon King, that expands upon Malcolm, because at that point, when you say all Black lives matter, you're excited about Tamika Mallory and you're not telling her to move off stage. You're excited about No Name, you're not telling her to move off stage. You're excited about the Black Trans Lives Matter March from June of 2020 in Brooklyn with 15,000 people, which included a bunch of cis people, and it's multiracial democracy being led by Black people. So in that sense, his ideas are generative, just like Ida Bell Wells has been generative, but what we're seeing is the face of the leadership and our understanding of dignity has become expansively encompassing. What I'll argue with Malcolm is that he was headed there before his assassination. He's saying this in one of the last interviews that, hey, the best countries, the most progressive countries in Africa, women are equal. So it doesn't mean that Malcolm dies a feminist, but he was heading towards the right side of history in ways that, comparatively to Dr. King, is much more ahead of the game. And part of it is because of his travel. Part of it is because he's in Ghana, he's in Nigeria, he's in Tanzania. And that's why Malcolm X's last year is one of the most important years in global political history that people just sort of try to ignore. Black studies scholars don't, but in a bigger way, we still don't talk about it, which is why, that's what I'm doing next. And it's so important. Malcolm goes from being this prosecuting attorney into this statesman. Malcolm is the prime minister of Black and third world peoples globally. And our proof is that he had an office at the United Nations. Our proof is that he is accompanied, starting in 1959, he's received as a head of state. They're not, the folks who are receiving him are serious people. These are serious people. And why are they receiving him? Because they understand what he represents. So in his own time, some people have tried to push back against what I write and say that, well, Malcolm wasn't well received in his own time. That's not true. It's only true if you're looking at white folks and we're looking at mainstream white folks in America. The most racist country on the planet Earth is the United States of America. We are more racist than South Africa, right? So of course they weren't giving him his legitimacy, and the New York Times is bragging when he's assassinated. But when you look at globally and what is Malcolm's global reception, you're seeing that this person is the prime minister who actually paves the way for Muhammad Ali. There is no Muhammad Ali without Malcolm X. Not just Elijah Muhammad, but Malcolm X. And it's really important for us to know that. And the positive of all these conversations is that we're getting him his due. And like any thinker, he's going to be criticized. There are shortcomings, there are failures, but he's got to be put alongside that Mount Rushmore of great thinkers. And certainly it's not just him. We could have a conversation on Angela Davis. There's a lot of Black folks, Ida B. Wells, who are not in that Mount Rushmore according to white folks and according to the American Academy, but globally they are. And that's why I love what Michael's done. You're decentering it, because the only reason we don't think about Malcolm X as this frontline intellectual and political leader, this generative thinker, Black studies people do, but I'm saying nationally is because of racism, everybody. That old bugaboo racism, it's a constitutive part of every single thing we do, and the people we choose to praise and elevate. And remember, we're the same country. We don't have a bunch of statues to Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans who loved humanity, right? We have them to Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. So part of why we don't elevate Malcolm and just take him seriously is because we're such a sick society, and that's one of the things he taught us.
Yeah, for John's next thought on this. I mean, I think it's so important what Peniel's saying about this question of Black dignity, right? Because Malcolm he shows dignity in the face of profound humiliation, which is something that we don't interrogate in theory enough, right? How humiliation is part and parcel, like an essential element of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, right? The humiliation of the Black parent in front of the child, right? The humiliation of going to a store and being denied things. Malcolm experienced all that humiliation and still was able to extract something like profound dignity out of it. I think that's one of the essential elements of his system of thinking to this point, right? And I think that's why he becomes such a global figure in the same way that Ali does, because it's all about the fact of telling, like you're saying, right? Like Peniel saying what Ali said, where he tells white people about themselves and does so in a way that's unapologetic and is also relatable to common conversations that everyone has, right? There's no Black person who doesn't understand exactly what Malcolm X is talking about, period. And I think that's critically important, and why it has such a broad reception across different perspectives, and also why the Academy wants to push it to the side in many ways. Right? It becomes it's like plumbers, right? With they take this pipe and might go into the little one, right? It has to be complicated enough so other people can't get at it. But Malcolm's doing something completely different that allows everyone to be that plumber, right? To be able to fix the things that they're in and around. So I think that's why it's so important to this elevation is so important of the system of thinking.
And maybe to this, around this issue of elevation and sort of expanding our sense of who Malcolm X was, but also sort of what he was in terms of an intellectual event, right, and a political event. I want to ask, and this is in particular a question for you, Peniel, but also obviously Michael would have thoughts on this. One of the things when I read The Sword and the Shield that I thought was so interesting was seeing how meticulously, and helps that you have multiple books on similar topics so you can do this so efficiently, but the way you really meticulously situate Malcolm X as a political thinker in the various but sort of two dominant trends, right? That's the title of African-American political thought. And in that sense, give us a really rich historical sense of where Malcolm X is coming from intellectually, what traditions he's a part of, which he's critiquing, that deep historical and intellectual contextualization, which any good scholarship does well. And I think the book is really exceptional in doing that. But as I was reading that, one of the things that kept sort of running through my mind was how much Malcolm X is an iconic figure, and icons, right? Everywhere from, every student union in fall semester has multiple posters of Malcolm X you can buy to put on your dorm wall. I think of, the film, Spike Lee's film, Malcolm X, and the ritual incantation of his name at the end, I am Malcolm X, I'm Malcolm X, and all sorts of things in between. And, the Malcolm X hat, for those of us of a certain age, was such an iconic moment for an iconic figure. But the thing about icons is they sort of stand outside of context. I mean, that's part of what the word icon means, is that there's a sort of fetish value and sort of magical quality of the object, right? But one of the things the Sword and the Shield does, as well as Black Minded, is really take away that sense of iconic and make, rather than what Malcolm X is, who Malcolm X is, right? And I would say in the present tense, because I think, everything both of you said about the present is so important. So I'm just curious, Peniel, if you thought about this as you were writing the book, what it would mean to, I don't want to say debunk, because that sounds confrontational, but the way in which this is sort of de-iconicizing of Malcolm X, and what do you think are some of the benefits of that? And do you think there are risks of that at all?
Yeah, no, thank you, John. I think that there are great benefits, and I think it's kind of like, Michael was saying about the plumbing analogy, and I like that, because the Nation of Islam said, "Make it plain," right? Make it plain. And so Malcolm is for me the most important working class Black social political activist, organizer, intellectual of the 20th century. And we can talk about Garvey and Garveyism and what he did institutional building wise and how that led to Malcolm. But I think Malcolm is unbelievably important. And I think thickening up that iconography where we don't have him as just this prophet of Black rage is really important. And I think the new works, including my own and Michael and the Manning Marable biography, the Les Payne and Tamara Payne biography. There's so many different works on Malcolm that you're getting to understand him. Garrett Felber, a human being within the context of mass incarceration. You see that Malcolm's born May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, and he's born during a second wave of white supremacist redemption that comes after Reconstruction and in between the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights period, that really starts in the context of both Garveyism and the Great Depression and Second World War, and that radicalism of that period that leads to, it's going to lead to Brown and VRA. So I think that there's a number of different things that we can do by focusing on Malcolm as a three-dimensional person, looking at the Little family and what they went through in Omaha and Lansing, and they were in Wisconsin as well. Looking at the fracturing of that Black family and the trauma that Malcolm goes through, but also the joys that Malcolm experiences. Malcolm is what he calls a farm boy. Malcolm sees his father as this strong Black man, and I think there are very complicated issues of masculinity there. And he sees his mother as this strong, brilliant Black woman who really instills in the little children the Black nationalist and self-determinative philosophy. And yet at the same time, Malcolm, between the ages of 12 and 20 on the streets of East Lansing and then Boston and Harlem, becomes part of the underground economy. So he confronts racial capitalism, white supremacy. He confronts all these things in his own life that continue to haunt us in our present. And so I think by giving us a thicker description of who this person is, and then also looking at the activism, because I think that post Spike Lee's film, what we've seen is different documentaries, including the Who Killed Malcolm X documentary. There's a Malcolm and Muhammad Ali documentary, scores of different books and anthologies, a much deeper conception of Malcolm X as this organizer, this activist, somebody who organized in the South before the Selma trips, who was in Birmingham, who was in Atlanta, who was in Florida, in the 1950s, somebody who the FBI is trying to contact and turn into an informer, and he refuses politely, even as other people in the nation will not refuse. Somebody who really builds up the Nation of Islam into a multi-million-dollar entity before being pushed out of that group, right? Somebody who's interested in politics and meets up with King at the United States Senate, but then sees King again in December of that year in Harlem and listens to him, but who visits the Albany, the State House, and listens to Nelson Rockefeller do the State of the State. So this is somebody who's intensely interested in institutions, whether they're in the Middle East, whether they're in the United States. He's interested in processes of politics, and he's also finally interested in the way in which history informs the political. And I think that's what's so important now for this contemporary generation, to see how Malcolm used history, and he understood that history was not past, it was how we made sense of the present. It's how we justify the present, right? And so I think what's so important about these books is that it gives you a fresh and up-to-date Malcolm X. And I agree with Michael that so much of what Malcolm saw and how he saw around corners nationally and globally, we're all experiencing in real time, you know? So he saw the movement for Black Lives. He saw what was happening. And, you know, he saw racial uprisings coming both during his lifetime, but then after his assassination. But this idea of dignity, and then I would add citizenship too, he saw that coming as well, because by the end, he's talking about citizenship as well. But finally, I'd say the biggest thing it shows us, John, is that Malcolm X is such a key human rights activist. Like, all these policy schools don't teach Malcolm X as a human rights activist. I do at the LBJ school because I'm there. But he is not a standard policy person. When people talk about human rights, they don't talk about Malcolm X. You have the poster of him, human rights with the rifle, right? You know, but that's what he is. He's a human rights champion. And we have to remember, he's saying that white people can be part of that human rights movement if they show sincerity, if they're sincere. And the sincerity is anti-racism, not just in theory, but in practice, right? So he tells, and that's why he gets the standing ovation at Oxford in 1964. The reason why he says he's gonna align himself with anyone, no matter what their skin color, as long as they wanna change the miserable condition on the face of this earth. And that condition has gotten even worse since he made that speech at Oxford.
So I think this kind of moves in a very similar direction. And a question to Michael about the particular theme of your book, this notion of Black-minded. I mean, one of the things I really love about the book is that it requires a slow read. I mean, it's very theoretically complicated and requires a lot of philosophical attention. And when I was reading it, one of the things that I thought of in terms of the significance of the book, right? I know you're in an English department, Africana Studies PhD, but your work is deeply philosophical, and so as a philosophy PhD, I really love that. And you know, philosophy as a discipline and sort of related theoretical fields have really struggled to expand their encounter with notions of race and racism, right? It's generally been one or two figures, you know, Du Bois and Fanon, right? Or a history of the concept of race. You know, where did it come from? Who invented it? Is it biological, cultural, political, right? And there's so little that's done in philosophical circles broadly, right? Which is different than a Black studies context. That goes without saying. But so little is done with the intimacy of race identity and thought. I'm thinking, you know, I think that largely gets boiled down to something like negritude, where Senghor and Césaire become this sort of mid-century moment of thinking about, you know, Blackness as a form of thinking. So I'm wondering, like, how you assess your own contribution. I have my own thoughts, which is that it's a really profound contribution that if it gets widely read will actually change the way people talk philosophically about this stuff. But how you assess this idea of Black-minded as pushing that question of race, identity, and thought deeper than a sort of history of, or simply being tracked through a particular figure. Obviously, the book is on Malcolm X, but it has bigger aspirations.
No, I really appreciate that. And I think this is to, and we had talked about this before, right? Like how your work on Glissant changed the way I read Glissant, right? Like basically, as I look back at these questions after having experienced a type of analysis in that way. So to this question of the philosophical, when I was working on the book, there was real tension. I don't know if tension is the right. I was cautious and worried about positioning Malcolm X within the system of political philosophy that is so profoundly dedicated to keeping Black thought out of it, right?
Yeah.
Black thought out of it and thinking about Black thought as well, right? Not just Black thought, but the possibility of thinking about Black thought from other perspectives, right? But, you know, I kind of did it anyway. And it wasn't, and it was not by accident that I wanted to resituate the question of political philosophy, to either render it capacious enough or more appropriately, and this is not my thinking, right? This is kind of what Fred Moten has said about the book, right? Is to elevate political philosophy to take stock of Malcolm X rather than the other way.
Yeah.
Think about Malcolm X
I love that.
becoming acceptable to political philosophy. It's just the opposite of that, right? Because we ought not, and part of being in the English department, right? And I tell students this all the time, right? We ought not think about the canon or even disciplines as being decolonized through reduction, right? It's through addition and through breaking down these types of barriers, right? So to add to Professor Joseph's point, right, to that kind of Mount Rushmore of thinkers, to make sure that Malcolm X is in that conversation, to me, resituates political philosophy kind of period. To this point that Peniel has about him being a human rights advocate, right? This kind of proto-feminism is thinking about certain things. To point to one of the questions that's in the chat, right? To, you know, he's thinking about Nasser, he's thinking about freedom movements in colonial Africa in a way, and is able to translate that for America in a way that Fanon does not understand Detroit, right? And you have to fit, you know, you have to cut Fanon to fit Detroit or Chicago or Newark, where Malcolm's already there. But what he's doing is he's taking stock of the African anti-colonial movements and understanding, and this is what's so important about Peniel's work on Stokely Carmichael, right? Where the inner city is understood to be a colony, right? And the Black Power movement's notion that the colony is here and the colony is internal to the actual metropole, right? Where the United States becomes the metropole, the colonies within it as opposed to outside of it, which creates a kind of different dynamic that Malcolm X is able to translate from what's going on in Africa with respect to freedom movements that are decentralized, and that the center is away from them, right? Where that's a much different conversation. This is a profoundly unique conversation to the diaspora, right? This is the plantation. This is the plantation as a site of coercion and the colony within and closely related to the project of a type of democracy, right? Where you see it right up front, right? This is the American South that he understands in ways that other thinkers do not. So I think that's where political philosophy as a discipline is enriched by the notion of Malcolm X becoming and Black-minded being a system of cognition, right? Rather than just a kind of slogan or something. It's actually, this relates to what I'm working on now, right? Where it's literally a way of seeing the world. It allows you to kind of discern and differentiate those things that elevate themselves to being both an existential question and an epistemological question, is what Black-minded is.
And you know, I want to add to what Michael is saying here, because I think that it's exactly right where he says about changing the way in which you see the world, because I argue in The Sword and the Shield that Malcolm changes the way King sees the world, you know, and certainly King helps him as well. But one of the biggest legacies of Malcolm is allowing us, one, transforming Negroes and colored people into Black people. And we act like that's not a big deal, first of all, you know, and we have Kamal Brathwaite, the Brathwaites are part of this, Ajaz, Penumbra, the Comingo photography group, obviously Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, but Malcolm's an early adopter of Black and African and Afro-American. Only reason why Kwame Ture can say we're an African people, it's not because of Nkrumah, it's because of Malcolm. It's because of Malcolm. And somebody was asking the Black thinkers who influenced Malcolm, besides people like Garvey, yeah, it's Nkrumah, it's Jomo Kenyatta, it's Muhammad Babu. He's influenced by people like Fannie Lou Hamer as well, and says as much. So there are these thinkers, but Malcolm forces us to see the world in a different way. And I like what Professor Sawyer said about epistemology, because epistemology is the philosophical foundations of knowledge and knowledge production. And what Malcolm does is force us away from a Western epistemology, right? And I like what Professor Sawyer said too. He's doing something that's both systemic, but also improvisational. He's extemporizing and making this, he's crafting and creating this political thought through his own experiences, both intellectually and experientially, right? And so when people say, well, what can we read to find this out? There's a brother who had done the speeches of Malcolm more as a big pamphlet speeches, and it's like 1,200 pages. And I had that and I'm losing the brother's title, his name. And it's a beautiful book because it gives you his speeches, it gives you his interviews, right? And it's 1,200 pages. And so when you think about and it's going to be much more important in certain ways than just the autobiography, because the autobiography is important, but it's also mediated through Alex Haley. It's mediated through Random House and then Grove Press, which publishes it, right? So it's important for us to understand Malcolm forces us to look at the world, American exceptionalism, liberalism in a different way. And I love what you said about political philosophy having to raise up to get access to Malcolm and not the reverse, because that's completely, and I'll give a shout out to the book by Turner, Rogers and Turner, African-American political thought, which just came out from University of Chicago Press. I'm teaching that in my black politics from Reconstruction to Black Lives Matter graduate seminar. That is really an essential book. I'm teaching it alongside of Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire. I'm teaching the 30 chapter African-American political thought, which is really Black and other political philosophers taking Toni Morrison seriously, Clarence Thomas, Phyllis Wheatley, Huey Newton, Malcolm, Martin, Bayard Rustin, right? CLR James, all of that is in there, right? But at the same time, teaching them Words of Fire, which is the epic anthology about Black feminist, cultural, political, literary production over a 200-year period. And it's integral for them to read that. So they're reading these political philosophers, but then they're also reading Audre Lorde and Beth Ritchie and Angela Davis, Mary McLeod Bethune, the whole works, right? And that's how we get them. And I'm just a historian doing this, so I'm not a philosopher. I just like to read and like to be, in these discussions, and as a student just learn. But it's really important. I love what Michael, Professor Sawyer has done in terms of political philosophy, because he's making us rethink the whole thing. And that's what this anthology does too, right? So we're doing revolutionary pedagogical interventions, but we're following Malcolm X's revolutionary pedagogical interventions. That's what he did for us, yet except for the Black studies and the Africana studies scholarship, people refuse to acknowledge us. But Africana studies does acknowledge it. And when we have brilliant philosophers and political theorists, Michael Sawyer, Brandon Terry, and others, they're just changing the game. So this is super exciting. That's why I'm a big cheerleader for all of this. And this is just very exciting to me to be a part of this.
Yeah, and I love that, both that image of can political philosophy, can philosophy in general, elevate itself to the demands of Malcolm X. I think that it's a decolonial sensibility in the sense of it, if it refuses a sense of center, right, from white supremacy. So I really love that that characterization and that imagery. I want to pick up the question from the chat from Chineria Suji. professor in African American studies, who asked about Black African thinkers who were an influence on Malcolm X, and maybe sort of ask her question alongside, because it's, you know, a nice specific kind of version of a broader question I had that you both talked quite a bit about, which is how to think about Malcolm X as both a local and a global figure. And so maybe, you know, I mean, it's interesting to think about, you know, Malcolm X as responding to the demands of Detroit, to the demands of Chicago, of Harlem, but also of the globe, right? Not just the Black Atlantic, but also across the globe, as in anti-colonial freedom, struggle, demands for emancipation. So, you know, specifically then around the question of Black African thinkers and their influence on Malcolm X, I'm interested, or I would ask a question sort of, you know, I guess it's about intellectual biography, you know, which ones impacted him and how. And around that, how those Black African thinkers impact him and sort of expand his global sensibility. Why do you think it's important to see him in relation to, you know, Kenyatta and Nkrumah and others?
I mean, I think this is to Peniel's point about where Malcolm resituates the question of the citizen, right? And what I mean here is he resituates the question of the citizen for the diasporic African person, and that it's a type of global citizenship. So in Nkrumah, Kenyatta, all these freedom movements in Africa that then become a place to then imagine the possibility of something like global or transnational existence for Black people in exile from Africa, right? With no coherent relationship. This is, John, I think to your point about how negritude tries to fill in this gap with a type of imaginary or mythology that's not, in many ways, is the same thing that the Nation of Islam was trying to do, right? Trying to explain the situation of Black people, to restore some system of dignity through a creation of a type of mythological relationship. What Malcolm says is the mythology is now, right? It's looking at what's going on in Ghana, it's seeing what's happening in Nigeria. It's even Francophone West Africa, right? Sekou Touré, these kinds of people, things are happening, right? And his thing is like the movement is here. And what he also does is he destabilizes the question of Black as a racial marker and renders it a subjectivity. So Black to him is probably what we would call it. So this is the global South, right? What he's describing is the global South that we describe now in that way. But he says everyone's Black who's under some oppressive regime from colonial power, right? And that's so much what he gets from examining the thinking of the freedom movements that are happening coincident with his kind of political awakening, or I shouldn't say political awakening, right? The awareness, the possibility of having a platform to display his interest in politics and his political theory is coincident with this kind of destabilization of the world, right? The world system becomes unstable at that point. And it's much about what it means to be Black in the world, right? Not so much Black, and being Black in Detroit is different than being Black in Ghana, right? And Accra. But what he's saying is that there's a way that you can bridge that gap, and it becomes a way of being that's really, really important for thinking about a type of radical reconstruction of subjectivity, right? So without that possibility of what's going on in Africa at the time, it's difficult to imagine where he would have anchored his system of thinking, right? Because he has an anchor in the kind of geographic reality of what's going on in West Africa at that time, to then be the place where he lands with his kind of theoretical and abstraction of something like citizenship in that way.
Yeah, and I would say that the anchor, Michael, I would argue would be twofold, because I like your Detroit analogy. I think the anchors are Africa and Harlem. And we can even say, when you think about the Middle East and say there's a triangulation, Africa, the Middle East, and Harlem, because what Malcolm is doing on the citizenship piece and the human rights piece is he is actualizing a global cosmopolitan Black internationalism. He's doing it. He's not asking for permission. He's just doing it. And he even writes in his diary that he's going to leverage his international reputation. He knows he has a global reputation. He had visited the Middle East in 1959. He had met with Anwar Sadat in 1959. He had visited with Prince Faisal. So he has these connections, which is why he goes to the head of the line to go to Mecca. You know, I mean, he even says it. He says, hey, you know, I was just trying to be in the back, and then they come through and it becomes a private car. And he's staying at the Isis Hotel in Egypt. So he actualizes this kind of diplomacy between the global North and global South that is really, really resonant now. When we look at BLM and the marches we saw in the UK, Germany, Nigeria, and other places, Malcolm is making an argument about sort of Blackness as indigeneity, right? Blackness as indigenous people all over the world who are being oppressed. And Malcolm also has a critique of what we're calling, you know, Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism or racist capitalism. So it's important that, and I can't stress this enough, to think of Malcolm as somebody who goes from being our prosecuting attorney as being this prime minister, you know, as being this prime minister who really visits more countries than Martin Luther King Jr., who meets in real time more world leaders than Martin Luther King Jr. overseas, right? So again, we act like Malcolm wasn't in Tanzania. He wasn't in Nigeria. He wasn't in Ethiopia. He wasn't in Ghana, right? He's in all those places, right? And he's actually meeting presidents and prime ministers, right? Like, how does that happen, right? That'd be very difficult to happen now because Malcolm wasn't head of a nation state, but he was head of a nation within a nation, an internal colony where the constituency at home realizes it, and then leaders globally realize it, and they give him that kind of access. And again, it's unprecedented. And I think one of the reasons why you could see Martin Luther King Jr. become a much more global figure who had traveled to India, had traveled to these places, is because of Malcolm's example. He's seeing what Malcolm's doing. They crisscross each other internationally because King's getting the Nobel Prize in '64, right? But Malcolm is spreading this message to universities. He's spreading it to diplomats, right? And remember, one of the unspoken histories of Malcolm is that Malcolm has an office at the United Nations. He's got an office. People know who he is. He can go through security because African and Middle Eastern diplomats have given him an office, right? That he uses for years. And we act like, I mean, that's why he introduces Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay says, how do you know all these people? He says, Cassius, these are my friends. These are friends of mine. He says, how do you know, and that's why Cassius is in awe of Malcolm, not the other way around. It's not, I get it. People think, wow, Muhammad Ali, heavyweight. Cassius is in awe of Malcolm, not the other way around. Malcolm thinks he's a brilliant brother who's 17 years his junior, okay, right? Cassius looks at him as an older brother who becomes Muhammad Ali in March. That's why I'm saying Cassius. February, he's not Muhammad Ali. And he's named Muhammad Ali because Elijah Muhammad takes him from Malcolm X, because Ali could have been the anchor to a new movement, a progressive Black Muslim or progressive Muslim movement headed by Malcolm in the United States and globally, and Elijah Muhammad takes him.
So as always with good events, we've already gone over time. It seems like we just got started. So let me, sort of abruptly end, which is always, it's awkward to abruptly end things. But I will say this, this hour of listening to both of you talk, certainly if people haven't read your books on X and King, I'm sure that they will, but I think more important than that, if anyone needed a moment to be reminded of why it's important for us to take Malcolm X seriously in the way that we read and think and write, this hour has absolutely done that. So thank you, both of you. It's fantastic, very generous with your time and thought.
Thank you so much. The people are asking the names. Azikiwe of Nigeria. I'm going to let Professor Sawyer say what other names. Muhammad Babu, who's Prime Minister of Zanzibar. When we're thinking about the names that are
we'll put together some list, and then because I think it's important to get it pinned down. And I think it's so diverse, right? It's like that. I think this is Peniel's point, right? He's literally in the middle of like this almost spider web of Black intellectualism at that time, right? Where you can't even, it's hard to discern like particular threads because there's so many, and he's in the center of the entire system. So it's really important.
Thank you, John. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Tita. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Professor Sawyer. Michael, love your work. And
I love it. Thank you.
It's really an honor.
I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very, very much. This is a strange ending. We just end and it goes into the ether, but I'm extremely, I know it's really weird. We can't have a continue this, but we will be in touch. We'll send follow-up and to Professor Sawyer's point about the importance of pinning down a bibliography and the kind of frame of reference. Thank you. So I'm clicking end, but this is not an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you.